Voyez-vous, l'impérialisme a tort. Mais l'impérialisme est un mauvais élève. C'est un mauvais élève.
The heat of Ouagadougou hung like a curtain, thick with dust and whispers of change. It was August 4th, 1983, the day soldiers marched, the day a young captain named Thomas Sankara took the microphone and declared that a revolution had begun. But before the world would know his name, before the African continent would call him its lost son, there was a boy born in the shadow of colonial rule, born in a land called Upper Volta, a country stitched together by European rulers who had never tasted its soil. Thomas Isidore Noel Sankara was born on December 21st, 1949, in Yako, a small town where red earth met savanna grass. His father, Joseph, had served as a gendarme in the French colonial army. His mother, Marguerite, was quiet but fierce, a woman whose strength would later echo in her son's defiance. The family was poor but proud, and their home carried the sounds of prayer, the smell of millet, and the discipline of a soldier's household. Thomas wasn't born to power. He was born to service, and from the start, he learned to question why others must kneel to survive. The French flag still fluttered above schools and barracks, and children were taught that civilization had arrived on European ships. But young Sankara, bright-eyed and restless, saw the contradiction. How could his people be called uncivilized when they fed the world with their labor? He watched his mother barter at the market, watched men toil under a sun that gave nothing freely, and in the evenings, he listened to his father speak of obedience, hierarchy, and loyalty. Yet something inside him whispered that true loyalty was to truth, not to those who commanded it. When he attended Catholic school, Thomas quickly stood out. He was brilliant, disciplined, but often punished for asking too many questions. Teachers saw promise, classmates saw rebellion. In those classrooms, he learned French literature, history, and arithmetic. But what captivated him most were the stories of resistance. The tale of Joan of Arc, the speeches of de Gaulle, the ideals of liberty and fraternity. The irony did not escape him. He admired the revolutionaries of France, even as their descendants ruled his homeland. By his teenage years, Sankara had begun to dream of something larger. His parents wanted him to become a priest. The priesthood was respectable, secure, but he wanted the army. The uniform represented strength, movement, and perhaps a chance to reshape the country from within. In 1966, he enrolled in the military academy in Ouagadougou. There, among the rigid drills and salutes, he discovered the writings of Karl Marx, Lenin, and especially Che Guevara. The young cadet would spend long nights reading by candlelight, his mind feeding on ideas of justice and revolution. He was quiet, serious, a man of few words but immense conviction. Fellow cadets recall him refusing to join in corruption or favoritism. When others pocketed extra rations, he gave his away to poorer recruits. He learned not just the art of war, but the moral cost of obedience. In 1970, as post-independence Africa struggled with coups and puppet regimes, Sankara's generation was awakening. Across the continent, leaders who had once promised liberation had become mirrors of their colonizers. In Ghana, Kwame Nkrumah had been overthrown. In Congo, Patrice Lumumba was long dead. Sankara watched this betrayal of ideals with growing anger. He realized that Africa's chains had merely changed hands, from white colonizers to black elites. His first posting took him to Madagascar for officer training. It was there, amid student protests and ideological ferment, that his political awakening crystallized. He saw peasants rise against corrupt rule, saw soldiers fraternize with civilians, saw the power of ideas to ignite action. He was no longer just a soldier. He was becoming a revolutionary. When he returned home, Upper Volta remained stagnant. The government, led by presidents loyal to France, thrived on foreign aid, while citizens starved. Thomas began to gather a small circle of like-minded officers, men who shared his frustration and his vision of dignity. Among them was Blaise Compaoré, a charming and ambitious soldier who would one day become his closest friend, and, later, his betrayer. In 1974, Sankara fought in a border skirmish with Mali. He led his men with unusual courage, refusing to hide behind ranks. When his unit captured enemy soldiers, he treated them not as enemies, but as brothers, caught on the wrong side of politics. His bravery made him a national hero. Newspapers praised his valor. Politicians sought to use his fame. But Sankara saw through the hollow celebration. He told comrades privately, "We fight wars that are not ours, for interests that do not belong to us." By 1980, Upper Volta was choking under military regimes and economic dependence. Sankara had risen to the rank of captain, commanding respect among both soldiers and civilians. He began giving speeches, not fiery yet, but piercingly honest, about corruption and the need for self-reliance. His message spread through barracks and universities. Africa must stand on its own feet. In 1981, a coup brought Colonel Saye Zerbo to power. Sankara was appointed Secretary of State for Information, a position meant to silence him through inclusion. Instead, he used it as a platform to speak truth. At press conferences, he criticized government excesses, denounced censorship, and demanded justice for the poor. His integrity made him dangerous. Within months, he resigned, famously declaring, "Misfortune for the people if those who hold power lack honesty." He was placed under house arrest, but his legend grew. Students began painting his name on walls. Workers whispered about the honest captain who dared to speak against generals. Even foreign journalists began to take notice. He was becoming the conscience of a nation drowning in silence. In 1983, another coup shuffled the deck again, bringing Jean-Baptiste Ouédraogo to power. Sankara, freed from arrest, was appointed prime minister. He traveled to international summits and met world leaders. It was during this period that he met leaders like Muammar Gaddafi and witnessed firsthand how African leaders were treated by the global powers. He saw the strings attached to every dollar of aid, the polite smiles masking deep contempt. At an international meeting in New Delhi, he reportedly told a colleague, "We must choose to produce what we consume and consume what we produce." That is freedom. His fiery independence unnerved the French-aligned government. Western diplomats warned that the young prime minister was too radical. Within months, pressure mounted for his dismissal. In May 1983, Sankara was arrested once again. Crowds poured into the streets demanding his release. In the chaos, Blaise Compaoré, his friend and ally, led a military revolt. On August 4, 1983, gunfire echoed through the capital. When the smoke cleared, a new voice spoke on radio. It was Captain Thomas Sankara. He announced the birth of a revolution. From that moment, the name Upper Volta would fade into history. The country was reborn as Burkina Faso, the land of upright people. Sankara took office not as a ruler, but as a servant. His first act was symbolic. He sold the fleet of government Mercedes cars and replaced them with modest Renault 5s. Ministers' salaries were slashed, and luxury privileges were banned. He refused air conditioning in his office. He rode a bicycle through the streets. To his people, he became one of them. To the elites, he became a threat. He declared war, not with weapons, but with conviction, against hunger, corruption, and dependency. We must learn to live African, to eat African, to dress African, he told a gathering of workers. under his leadership, vaccination campaigns eradicated measles and meningitis. Millions of children were immunized in weeks, an achievement praised even by the World Health Organization. He launched reforestation drives to combat desertification, planting millions of trees in the Sahel. He championed women's rights, outlawing forced marriage and female circumcision, appointing women to high offices, and urging men to share domestic work. The revolution cannot triumph without the liberation of women, he declared. But his greatest challenge lay beyond his borders. The International Monetary Fund and the World Bank were tightening their grip on African economies. Sankara rejected their loans, saying, "He who feeds you controls you." He called for a united African front to refuse debt repayment, arguing that the debts were colonial in origin. "If we repay," he warned, "we will die. If we refuse, we will live in Addis Ababa." 1987, before the Organization of African Unity, he delivered a speech that shook the hall. "The debt," he said, "is a cleverly managed reconquest of Africa, aiming to make our economies dependent again." Delegates applauded, but few dared to follow him. He had challenged not only global powers, but the comfort of his peers. At home, his radical reforms began to unsettle the privileged. Traditional chiefs lost their tax rights. Civil servants complained of strict discipline. France watched nervously as its former colony drifted toward true independence. Within his circle, jealousy grew, especially in Blaise Compaoré, the friend who once called him brother. Rumors of plots multiplied. Sankara seemed aware. Friends recall him saying, "While revolutionaries as individuals can be murdered, you cannot kill ideas." Yet he continued walking without guards, riding his bicycle through the streets, trusting the people more than the guns around him. On October 15, 1987, he attended a meeting at the Conseil de l'Entente, unaware that his closest ally had turned against him. Shots rang out. Within minutes, the dream of Burkina Faso fell silent. Sankara and 12 of his comrades lay dead. The revolution was decapitated. Blaise Compaoré seized power, claiming it was rectification. The body of the man who had asked Africa to stand upright was buried in a shallow grave. News spread like wildfire. Across Africa, students wept. In Ghana, Nigeria, Senegal, protests erupted. France remained quiet. The world moved on, but the people did not forget. Mothers named their sons Thomas. Murals appeared in hidden alleys. His speeches, once banned, circulated in whispers and tapes. Years passed, and yet his ghost refused to fade. Burkina Faso sank into corruption and dependency once more, but Sankara's image grew. He became myth, memory, movement. His words began to resurface on the tongues of a new generation, those who saw that Africa's chains had not vanished, only changed form. Today, decades later, his voice still cuts through time. We must dare to invent the future. His revolution lasted only 4 years, but it changed the imagination of an entire continent. He showed that leadership could mean humility, that dignity could be stronger than fear. The man was buried, but the idea was not. The days after Sankara's assassination were heavy with silence. The streets of Ouagadougou, once alive with chants of "La patrie ou la mort, nous vaincrons," now whispered fear. Soldiers patrolled with uneasy eyes. Families hid radios beneath blankets to hear forbidden songs of the revolution. Mothers told their children not to speak his name too loudly. Yet in market stalls and dusty courtyards, the people mourned quietly. They knew what had been taken from them was not only a leader, it was the possibility of standing tall without permission from anyone. In the first nights after his death, the radio played military music. Announcers spoke in careful tones, calling for calm and continuity. Blaise Compaoré appeared on television in a neatly pressed uniform, promising to rectify the revolution. He claimed that Sankara had become divisive, that the new government would restore order. But the people could see the difference. Sankara had spoken with fire. Compaore's words were smoke. Outside the capital, farmers wept. Many had met Sankara personally. He had visited their villages without warning, eaten their millet, listened to their grievances. They remembered how he had sat on the ground beside them, how he had refused special chairs. "He was one of us," an old farmer in Kudugu said years later. "He spoke like a man, not like a god." Foreign embassies breathed easier. For them, the removal of Sankara meant stability, meaning predictability. Aid would flow again, contracts could resume, and Burkina Faso would once more bend to the rhythm of global finance. Paris sent polite condolences, Washington sent silence, and the IMF waited with open arms. But even in death, Sankara unsettled them. International newspapers carried his image, the tall soldier with the red beret and the calm eyes. Headlines called him Africa's Che Guevara, the idealist slain by his friend. Youth across the continent pasted his picture on dorm walls. In Ghana, student unions quoted his speeches. In Nigeria, underground newspapers printed his last words. "You can kill a man, but not his ideas." Back in Ouagadougou, a woman named Mariam Sankara held her sons close. She had lost not only her husband, but her protector, her comrade. Under house surveillance, she refused to renounce his legacy. Years later, she would say, "They thought they buried him, but they planted a seed." The years that followed were cruel. The rectification government reversed nearly all of Sankara's reforms. Prices rose again. Chiefs regained privileges. Luxury cars returned to ministries. Foreign debt grew, swallowing the fragile independence he had built. The tree planting programs stopped. The forests began to die. Women who had marched proudly beside him retreated once more into silence. But memory is a dangerous thing. It keeps truth alive when regimes cannot. Young Burkinabe, who had grown up under his short rule, carried stories like relics. They told of the president who rode a bicycle, who played guitar in the evening with soldiers, who planted trees with his bare hands. Teachers secretly used his speeches as lessons in integrity. Musicians turned his words into songs. In time, these fragments would become a movement again. To understand the power of Sankara's message, one must look at what he tried to do in only 4 years. In a continent plagued by dependency, he demanded self-reliance. When the government needed offices, he told ministers to build them themselves with local materials. When officials requested imported rice, he said, "Eat what we grow." He replaced the colonial flag with one bearing a red star, the mark of revolution, and changed the country's name from Upper Volta, a relic of the French map, to Burkina Faso, the land of upright people. The citizens became Burkinabe, upright men and women. Under his leadership, literacy campaigns swept the countryside. Volunteers taught thousands to read using chalkboards made from scrap wood. Health workers rode motorbikes through villages, vaccinating children. Within months, diseases that had ravaged generations were nearly wiped out. UNICEF called it a miracle achieved with almost no foreign aid. Sankara refused to wear tailored suits. He appeared in cotton, made by local weavers. When foreign journalists mocked his plain attire, he smiled. "We choose to dress for our reality, not for their approval." He cut the salaries of senior officers, banned first-class flights for officials, and made ministers declare their assets publicly. He himself owned little more than a few guitars, a bicycle, and the modest salary of a soldier. These gestures were more than symbolism. They were rebellion in practice. He wanted to prove that leadership could be service, that Africa could stand without begging. "We must dare to invent the future," he told youth gatherings. To women, he said, "The revolution and women's liberation go together. We do not talk of revolution without emancipation." He urged men to fetch water, cook, and understand the labor of those they claimed to lead. His defiance angered powerful interests. Traditional chiefs accused him of destroying their authority. Businessmen resented his price controls. Foreign companies disliked his insistence on local production. Yet the poor adored him. They saw in him a man who looked them in the eye, who demanded nothing of them except dignity. Internationally, he became both admired and feared. At the 1986 Non-Aligned Movement Summit in Harare, he denounced the hypocrisy of world powers. "They talk of human rights," he said, "while starving the world's children through debt." Cameras caught the stunned faces of diplomats, unused to such plain speech. Even those who disagreed with his Marxist leanings admitted his honesty was disarming. But truth, spoken loudly, attracts enemies. Within his inner circle, discontent festered. Blaise Compaoré, once his brother in arms, began to drift away. He complained that Sankara was isolating Burkina Faso from allies, that the revolution was moving too fast. Some say foreign emissaries whispered in his ear, promising support if he removed the troublesome captain. Others say jealousy alone drove the wedge. Whatever the cause, betrayal took root quietly, watered by fear and ambition. In early 1987, Sankara sensed danger. He told close friends that he might not live to see the revolution mature. "What we are building," he said one evening, "is larger than us. Even if they kill me, others will carry the flame." Witnesses recall him walking alone through the presidential compound at night, thinking, perhaps, of the cost of conviction. Still, he refused to flee. When foreign allies offered protection, he declined. He continued to attend public meetings without heavy security, playing football with youth on weekends. His confidence came from faith in the people and in destiny. Then came October 15th. The day began like any other. Sankara arrived at the Conseil de l'Entente around 4 in the afternoon for a routine meeting with comrades. Minutes later, gunfire shattered the calm. Soldiers loyal to Compaoré surrounded the building. Witnesses said Sankara rose from his chair, unarmed, and told his men, "Stay calm. It's me they want." Seconds later, he was gunned down. 13 men died with him. Their bodies were hastily buried, their families forbidden to mourn publicly. That night, radio stations played the national anthem repeatedly, then announced the tragic death of Captain Sankara. Compaoré's new government promised reconciliation. Instead, it began erasing him, removing portraits, banning his speeches, rewriting textbooks. Yet erasure failed. The soil that covered his grave could not silence the memories of those who had seen him plant trees with his own hands. As years turned into decades, Burkina Faso's youth began to dig, literally and figuratively, into their history. In the 2000s, when the internet reached West Africa, Sankara's words resurfaced online. Video clips of his speeches went viral among students who had not been born when he died. His call for African unity and self-respect resonated with a generation frustrated by corruption and foreign domination. In 2014, after 27 years of Compaoré's rule, crowds filled the same streets that had once fallen silent. They carried portraits of Sankara, chanting his slogans. "La patrie ou la mort," they cried, echoing the voice lost decades earlier. The uprising forced Compaoré to flee the country. For the first time in a generation, Sankara's spirit seemed to breathe again through the dust of Ouagadougou. When investigators finally exhumed his remains in 2015, the bullets were still there, proof of betrayal long denied. In 2022, after a long trial, Blaise Compaoré was found guilty in absentia of Sankara's murder. Justice came late, but it came. As the verdict was read, old men and women wept openly, Young activists held up red berets in salute. "He is not dead," one shouted. "He lives in us." Today, murals of Sankara stand on school walls across Africa. His speeches are studied in universities, quoted by rappers and presidents alike. Even global economists cite his warnings about debt dependency. In a world still struggling with inequality, his voice feels prophetic. He once said, "We must choose either champagne for a few or safe drinking water for all." Decades later, those words still sting. Across the continent, leaders fly private jets, while citizens fetch water from wells. Sankara's ghost haunts every palace built with borrowed money. He dreamed of an Africa that would rise through honesty and courage, not through aid. His life proved that such integrity was possible, but also perilous. Yet in the hearts of millions, he remains the benchmark of what leadership should be: humble, self-sacrificing, visionary. Even outside Africa, his legacy has spread. In Latin America, activists invoke him beside Che Guevara. In Europe, students quote his defiance of the IMF. In the Caribbean, reggae songs call him the Lion of the Sahel. Each retelling renews the idea that a single life, lived without compromise, can shake empires. And so the story of Thomas Sankara continues, not as a closed chapter, but as a mirror. It asks every generation, what does it mean to stand upright in a world that rewards bending? His answer was his life itself, a short, brilliant flame that refused to bow.